Welcome back, zoologists. So now we're going to transition from talking about the fishes to talking about the tetrapods. So these are animals that, generally speaking, have four different limbs. And we're talking about animals that then made the transition from water onto land. And this was a major evolutionary transition, and a lot of different organ systems had to be adapted to make this successful for them. So one of the major issues that had to be accommodated was respiration. So how are you then going to extract oxygen on land in air versus being in the water? So we've already discussed how in an aquatic environment you usually have gills or some sort of gill-like structures or modifications to your epithelium to allow for extraction of extraction of air, oxygen into your body. But now when you're on land, you have to have different structures. So your typical gills, like many fishes have, won't really work. They have to remain moist in order to extract that oxygen, and they also have to stay in an upright position. We talked about those gill rakers holding them open. So there had to be some way to actually keep them from drying out and keep them open so that they can extract oxygen from that environment into their bodies. Well, on land, you're going to have a big problem with desiccation and with keeping those gills open and not collapsing on themselves. And so what you're going to need is either modifications to your skin to be able to allow that to happen, and or the development of lungs. And as we already saw, there were these fishes that had already developed lungs, and so they were already pre-adapted to make that transition onto land. But there are several other things that need to be modified as well. These are some important considerations to take into account when you compare and contrast oxygen on land versus oxygen in the water. So, and we're talking about the available oxygen that you can actually take into your body. There's other forms that you can't take into your body. So, oxygen is 20 times more abundant in air than it is in the water. Okay? Air is 1,000 times less buoyant, and it's 50 times less viscous. So what that means is that you not only have to have adaptations for extracting oxygen from the air to get it into your body, but now you're also dealing with a less buoyant environment, right? So now you're going to have to deal with gravity. So when you come out onto land, you're going to have physical structures that allow you to be able to walk on land, or at least to pull your body up off of land. And ideally, you have muscles and a support structure that allow you to hold your head up as well, right? So you need to counteract the actions of gravity. So you're going to need some really strong limbs in order to be able to do that. You're also going to need some really strong muscles to power those limbs. And so I'm showing you a picture of a salamander. So these are guys that do it pretty well. You don't want to be like this polar bear. Like, imagine if you didn't have the appropriate muscles, you'd be dragging your head on the ground. There's a reason this polar bear is actually doing that. Some other considerations for the transition to land is temperature regulation. So when you come out on land, so you don't really realize this, but in an aquatic environment, particularly a marine environment, the temperature is relatively stable all year round. Now there are some differences when you go towards the poles, and yes, there are some seasonal differences, but once you get deep enough into the water, it's pretty constant all of the time. Well, when you come out on land, the temperature might not be the same as what you're used to in the water, clearly. And depending on where you are coming out on land, temperature might fluctuate quite dramatically throughout the year. So compare the way Michigan transitions from summer to winter. But even in the tropics, even though the temperature itself might be the same, humidity might not be the same. And there are dry and wet seasons where the temperature does change a little bit. So you're going to have to make those accommodations in your physiology to be able to be successful on land. So I'm showing you here an image. Now this is just of the Americas, but this is showing you not so much the temperature differences, but the biome differences, so the habitat differences. So you're going to have to deal with everything from tropical environments where it might be lush and vegetative, and there are certain sorts of flora and fauna here that are going to be very different from what you exhibit in the alpine Canadian regions, right? So all kinds of different resources that are going to be in these different areas that you're going to have to adapt to in order to be successful. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that the transition onto land was quite daunting, but clearly many organisms were very successful and did that very successfully. So let's talk about some of those transitional forms that existed and then eventually made it up onto the land. And one of the major features I want to focus on here is the features that evolved in an aquatic environment and were present before they actually made it onto land. So one of the classic fossil forms that we look at is Eusthenopteron. So this is a late Devonian lobe-finned fish, and you can see those paired fins here. And this is a close-up, or this is a diagram rather, of the osteology within that fin. And what I want you to notice is, so they're showing you a bit of the skull here, and what you want to see are these homologous elements that you see throughout the vertebrates. So you have the clavicle here, you have the humerus, the radius and the ulna, and then you have these dermal rays just after you get past these bony elements here. And so what you're noticing here is that already in these fish forms, you're seeing homologous bony elements to the vertebrate limb elements, the same elements that you see in typical tetrapods on land. So these were already present in fish forms, but in this particular fish form, these were clearly being used for swimming, for locomotion. These wouldn't have allowed Eusthenopteron to actually walk onto land, and it wasn't known to have been on land. But those elements were present. So they're homologous to the tetrapods, I say here, could paddle through probably bottom mud, but wasn't capable of walking yet. But here's the precursors, the present. Later, Tiktaalik was discovered, and it's thought to be an intermediate between Eusthenopteron and later tetrapods. And it had even stronger limb elements, and it's thought that these limb elements probably could have supported its body somewhat, but it probably wasn't capable of doing very good walking on land if it ever did at all. And this is a reconstruction of what it would have looked like. So you can see, still a very fish-like form, has a fish-like tail, but those limb elements are homologous to what we have in later tetrapods. Acanthostega is another in the lineup. So what you see here in this reconstruction, by the way, this is referred to as one of the earliest known tetrapods, so one of the guys that probably did make it onto land. So clearly the limb elements are present. You now see the fin rays have evolved into a more phalange or finger-like construction. You see the humerus, the radius, and the ulna, and the carpals. And what you should notice is that these limb elements are much more robust. So they're a lot stronger. Presumably they had the associated muscles to power them, and you're starting to see the girdle elements, both the pectoral and the pelvic elements, which I'm not showing you here, are much more robust and are probably better able to allow for the locomotion on land. So well-formed limbs. They're well-formed, but probably too weak to make it on land. But if we compare that to Ichthyostega here, and you can see the reconstruction here, and in this particular image, which is unfortunate from the book, it's showing you the pelvic girdle rather than the pelvic girdle rather than the pectoral, which I wish they had been consistent with these. But in any case, at least they're showing you what the pelvis looks like as well. So here you're seeing the associated femur, tibia, fibula, the tarsals and the metatarsals and phalanges. Also very robust, very strong looking elements. And in this case, the girdles are pretty well developed. They're bulky, so probably they could have walked on land, but it would have been kind of clumsy. Not unlike what you maybe see in crocodilians. So yeah, they can walk on land, but it's clumsy looking. They're much better in water, and they can't go very far, and that's largely due to their physiology. They can do bursts of energy, but they can't run, for miles. So one important take-home message I want you to get is that these limbs had developed in water before they actually came out on land. And that's a major transition from what earlier textbooks used to tell you. There used to be this emphasis or this hypothesis that maybe fish-like organisms came out on land first, somehow walked around with their fins, and then later developed limb elements. But we now know that that's not true. The limbs were present before they actually came out onto land. So these guys that we've been talking about, all of these extinct forms, these were the lineages that were ancestors to the amphibians. And we're going to be focusing on talking about the amphibians in this lecture. But there are a couple of other points I want to make before we move on that are in this chapter. And one important ancestor is Limnocellus. So this was an anthracosaur. This is not an ancestor to the amphibians. This is an ancestor to the amniotes, actually. But I just wanted you to see that it had a similar shape and form to some of the extinct amphibian ancestors that we looked at. And they're focusing here on the limb elements again. So you can see the shoulder girdle here, and then the humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, and phalanges. So this guy was an ancestor that led up to the reptiles, and then later on the rest of the amniotes. And we'll talk about them in a subsequent lecture. So this is one of the extinct forms I also want you to know. I'll show you the tetrapod video when we are in lecture. Okay, so now let's focus on modern tetrapods and specifically on the amphibians. So we'll define the group and talk about the included taxa, and then we'll talk about we'll talk about the features that they all share in common. And then we'll separate out each of the three orders that we're going to cover today. So the Anura, which are the frogs and toads, the Caudata, which are the salamanders, and the Gymnophionans, which are the caecilians. And you can see a few images here of these guys. And later on, in a subsequent lecture, we'll talk about these guys. Okay, so this is the phylogeny from your group, and I know it's a bit daunting. A lot of times when they present these, it's a little bit of sensory overload. So let me direct you. So we've already covered these taxa here. So this is the coelacanth and the lungfish. We covered that last time. And then there's some extant groups. We talked about a few of them. We talked about a few ichthyostagans and actually temnospondals, even though I didn't use those terms. So let me simplify this phylogeny for you by showing you this. So basically, here's what we've got. We've already talked about the coelacanth and the lungfish. There's really only two groups they're showing you in this phylogeny here. You have the amniotes and you have the amphibians, which I've abbreviated here. Now, these two guys together form the tetrapoda. So we're going to talk about this clade today, and then the rest of the semester we're going to break out the amniotes and talk about all the members of the amniota. Okay? Now, they show this here. So here's the amniota here. And then this is the amphibian group, right? And they've kind of complicated this tree by showing you where the extinct fossil forms are. That's what they've added on to here. And then here you see tetrapoda, okay? So I don't particularly like this orientation. I sort of prefer to flip these two nodes and show it as amphibians first and then amniotes. But just remember that these nodes can flip, and so that doesn't change the relationships in any way or form. They're the same set of relationships. I just prefer to show it as here's the group I'm talking about now, and here's where I'm going to go later. That's my only beef. But here's where we're going to go. So let's talk about the amphibians. So this is another figure from your book, and what it's trying to emphasize is how far back these guys go. So here are the extant forms, the ones that are still around, so the frogs and toads, the salamanders, and the caecilians. But you can see that they go way back, and here are some of their extinct ancestors. They go back to this Sarcopterygian ancestor. So in the Devonian is when you start to see them arriving. So about 370 million years ago. And they started really diversifying in the Carboniferous. So about 300-ish million years ago, maybe a little earlier. And they started really diversifying out into what we see now. So let's go into these groups. So just a little bit more about some of the extinct ones. So the temnospondals, these are the extinct amphibians that I talked about earlier. One major feature that they exhibited was having 4 digits on the forelimbs. So they have 4 fingers on the forelimbs, and they usually have 5 on the hind limbs. And that's a pattern that you still see in extant amphibians. This term, Lissamphibia, this refers to all extant amphibians. Amphibia is the term that's applied to include extinct and extant taxa altogether. Okay. Now, a lot of people use those terms interchangeably, Lissamphibia and amphibia, and often when people talk about the amphibians, it seems like they're really only talking about the ones that are still around now. But what you should know is that the Lissamphibia is only the extant ones. Amphibia refers to both extinct and extant. And I already told you this, they diversified in the Carboniferous. And these are the three orders we're going to talk about. By the way, pet peeve about your book. Your book seems to flip-flop between using the terms that apply to just the extant ones and the terms that apply to extinct and extant, so the stem versus crown terms. So for instance, sometimes they use caudata to refer to the salamanders, and sometimes they use Urodela. I try to be consistent, and I only use Anura, caudata, and Gymnophiona. Sometimes I flip, but usually I just use those three, but it's really annoying because your book is not consistent. And don't worry, I'll never try to trick you on those terms. I'll try to stay consistent with the terms that I use and the terms that I think you should use. Okay, so here's a phylogeny of the relationships among these three orders, and I do want you to know this phylogeny. So the first split is between the frogs and toads, so the Anura versus the other two. And so the caudata, the salamanders, this is really the term you should use, caudata. The caudata and the gymnophionans are sister taxa. So the gymnophionans is probably a group you're not going to be as familiar with. These only occur in tropical regions around the world. They're commonly referred to as the Sicilians. So no, these aren't little people from an island off the coast of Italy. It's a completely different organism. So they're very worm-like looking, and we'll talk about their details in just a moment. So what are the features that all of the amphibians have in common? So they are generally adapted for a terrestrial life. So they have limbs. Most of them, but not all of them, have lungs. They're capable of existing on life. But they are characteristically biphasic. So these guys do need to be tied to water at least for part of their life, usually for the reproductive end of their lives. Some of them exist their entire lives in an aquatic environment. But they're not completely separate from the water. They need this to breathe. Most of them need water for reproduction, but not all of them. We'll talk about exceptions to the rule. So this is like a classic diagram that you learn about, I think, maybe in elementary school. So this is a classic sort of amphibian life cycle, even though as it happens and as you'll learn, this is only classic for certain forms of frogs, and it's definitely not representative of all amphibians, and certainly not all amphibians throughout the world. And we'll talk about those exceptions. But here's what you normally see, and it is true for some. So you have an adult frog here. They go to the water to reproduce, so they lay their eggs. They are oviparous, but those eggs are externally fertilized, and so that's what's happening here. So the female releases her eggs, the male covers them with sperm to fertilize them. The eggs then hatch into some sort of larval form that usually looks like a tadpole in the case of frogs. It's not unlike that. There is a larval form for the salamanders. They will then go through metamorphosis where they develop legs, and they, in the case of frogs, resorb the tail, and ultimately they come back out on land, and then they live their lives out on land. That's sort of classic, and later on in the lecture and in class I'll tell you about the exceptions to the rule in the case of this life cycle slide. So the eggs are usually aquatic. They do undergo metamorphosis. Many of them are at risk for desiccation, so they need to stay wet in order to respire and to survive. But there are many examples of amphibians that have adaptations that allow them to go at least a little ways from the water for some parts of their lives, but not completely. And they are also ectothermic. So that's a term we need to define, and we probably need to put it in the context of all physiology. So let's talk about that. So that term ectothermy, some people call cold-blooded, which isn't really an appropriate term. nor is it accurate. So ectothermy refers to where you get your body temperature from. So the control of your body temperature is external. So it's basically controlled by the environment. But individuals that are ectothermic do have some control over that from the standpoint of behavior. So they can move into the sun, let's say, to bask and to heat up. They can move out of it to cool off. They can do a number of things to change their body temperature. But it is true that it's not controlled internally, it's externally. Reptiles have this problem too, or this situation too, or condition, I guess I should say, which is why I'm showing you a slide of a chameleon. This is in contrast to endothermy. So in this case, you're controlling the body temperature internally. So you have a metabolic condition where you can actually maintain your body temperature. And so this is what's classically seen in mammals, but in birds as well. So those two terms, ectothermy and endothermy, have to do with where your body temperature comes from. But that's different from if your temperature varies or not. And sometimes they're coincident. So poikilothermy is a term that applies to when your body temperature varies versus staying constant. And so usually if your body temperature varies, it's usually matching the environment. So most of the time, animals that are ectothermic are also poikilothermic. So their body temperature is varying with the environment, and you can actually see this over the course of a day, never minding over the course of seasons. So you actually see it heating up during the day and cooling down during the nighttime. And this is very common with amphibians and of course with a lot of fish. However, there are, in contrast is the term homeothermy. So this is the body temperature being kept constant by your metabolism. And so this is what we have going on and what birds have going on. Now, as it happens, there are some exceptions to the rule. So there are some animals that are ectothermic, certain fish that live in the Arctic, where, as it happens, the temperature of the water is incredibly constant. It never changes. And so they would actually be referred to as being homeothermic from the standpoint of their temperature isn't varying. However, it's not varying because they're regulating it internally by their metabolism. It's just because their environment is staying the same and is not varying. So there are a few weird exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, ectotherms are also poikilothermic and endotherms are generally homeothermic. So those are terms that you should be familiar with and commit to memory. So let's go back to the amphibians. So let's talk about these groups. So the order Gymnophiona are the caecilians, these worm-like creatures I told you about. So when you see them in life, by the way, they do look like giant worms, but you can tell the difference because they do have a really distinct head region, and they're kind of tough. So they have scales on their body, but not like with fish and not like with reptiles. It's just that they have a hardened, keratinized set of plates on them that make them really tough on the outside. And so let me show you a close-up. So here you can see the head region. It's usually pretty distinctive, and this is the tail region. You can see these grooves on their body, which indicates where these keratinized, these hardened regions are on their body. But you can see it definitely looks like a worm, and some of these are big. They look like really giant worms. So they are fossorial, another term that you should commit to memory. So they're burrowing. So generally speaking, they are underground, usually in the soil, sometimes just underneath the leaf litter. Again, these guys occur throughout the tropics around the world. And as a result of this fossorial lifestyle, they really aren't visually oriented at all. And so they've lost vision. And so either they're completely blind because they have no eyes, or the eyes are reduced, and then they often will have skin that actually covers up their eyes. And so they effectively can't see, but they have incredible abilities for chemosensation. So they have these little tentacles that are just in between their nose and their eyes that they can use to sense the environment around them. And they're generally consuming worms or small invertebrates or things that are in the soil. They are often very colorful. They can vary in color and size and patterns dramatically. And here you can, by the way, see, like, you can just see where the eye would be, but it's covered over by a little bit of cartilage and some skin. Here's the nares, the nasal passages. Can't really see the eyes in here. And this guy actually does have eyes right here. They're a little hard to see, but they are there. They often give live birth, although some do lay eggs, as you see here. But these are some examples of ones that actually have live birth, and you can see their babies there. They have this truly bizarre adaptation where, for those individuals that lay eggs, they will often either put them in a burrow like this, or sometimes what they'll do is they'll dig a burrow down that has water around it, and then they'll build a little mound, not unlike a beaver, a little mound of dirt or a little pedestal, and they'll lay the eggs on top. And sometimes what they will do is when they hatch out, they'll actually scrape cells on the outside of the body to actually feed. Yeah. But what's even weirder is the ones that give birth to live offspring, when they're developing inside the mom, before they hatch, they will actually, they have specialized teeth that they'll use to scrape cells off the inside of the oviduct, and that's what they consume for nutrition until they're born. So it's kind of like a creepy baby actually eating you from the inside out. Really bizarre. Truth is stranger than fiction, I keep telling you guys. Okay, the second order is what I prefer to use the term caudata, and that's what most herpetologists will use. So this refers to all of the salamanders. So you can distinguish these guys from the gymnophionans, which some people think of as being strange or unusual salamanders, in that typically with salamanders, they are moist, they have 4 legs, and they have a tail. That's how you could explain it to any sort of layperson, how you'd know a salamander. These guys can vary really dramatically in size from, and actually this is a fairly big one, but from being little guys that you can hold in your hand up to the Cryptobranchidae, this is actually a Japanese form, but we have them in the Ozarks in the United States as well. So these are called hellbenders. They can be really big. They can get as long as 6 feet from head to tail. So they all lay eggs. The environments in which they lay these eggs might vary, but they are quite famous, salamanders in general, for having a fair bit of parental care. So usually one of the parents, usually the female, will stay nearby. They'll make sure that the eggs stay moist. They'll do this in part by either putting them in a moist environment, or many of them will actually absorb water and then come and they'll actually urinate on the eggs, but that urine is not high in nitrogen content, so it's mostly just water that they're releasing onto them. When you look at the morphology of salamanders, their limbs are generally at right angles to their body, so kind of straight out like this, okay? Not unlike alligators. So most of them will lay these eggs, but there are some that are, and so when they hatch out of those eggs, they usually occur in a larval form that have to exist in the water for a period of time until they're big enough to go through metamorphosis and come out on land. When they're in those larval forms, they have external gills that are on either sides of their head, just beside the ear openings and behind the eyes. And so they use those to extract oxygen from the water and into their bodies. And then when they go through metamorphosis, they lose those gills, they resorb them, they come out on land. Often they have sort of a tail fin, so they have extensions on their tail to make them better for locomotion in the water. And some of that gets resorbed when they come out on land. And then on land, they are generally respiring with lungs, but there is one of the largest groups of salamanders, particularly in the United States, are the Plethodontidae, which are well known as being lungless salamanders. So all amphibians, and particularly salamanders, can respire through their skin. There are certain regions of the body where they are able to better respire compared to others, and generally that's in the groin region and in the ventral region. But they can respire throughout their skin, even if they do have lungs. And so direct development in this case is talking about those salamanders that can then hatch out of the eggs just in that very small but adult morphology. And so they don't have gills, they don't have the heightened tail, They come out looking like small adults, and then all they need to do is grow to become big adults. So in class, I'll tell you a little bit more about reproduction, but with most salamanders, what they do is they lay eggs, so they're oviparous, as we said on the previous slide, and they have internal fertilization. The way most of them do, not all of them, but most of them do. And when they do, they go through a really elaborate courtship behavior, which we'll talk about in class. But what I want to point out here in this slide is this structure, the spermatophore. So what males will do is they do not have intromittent organs, so they can't actually insert the sperm into the female. What they do is they release what are called spermatophores. So it's basically a pack of sperm that's got sort of a gelatinous mucus sort of coating around it, so it makes like a little pack. And they often set it on the ground on a little pedestal of its proteinaceous sort of gel-like structure. And then they lead the female over that spermatophore, and she picks it up and inserts it into her cloaca, and the sperm then emerge and travel up her reproductive tract to fertilize her eggs. This is a slide just to tell you a little bit more about salamanders. So you're probably familiar with what are called newts, which some people mistakenly think are geckos, but no, they're salamanders. But they have a really interesting lifestyle in that the adults are generally aquatic. They stay within the water at all times, even though they do not have external gills. They actually respire through their skin, but they will come up for air. They do have lungs. So what happens is that adults will mate in the water, lay their eggs, and attach them to submerged vegetation. They hatch out into these larval forms that you see here, and here's where you can see the external gills. Then, after metamorphosis, they come out on land, and they form what's called a red eft. And so these efts have quite dry, rough skin, so it's thickened skin that prevents desiccation. They're almost toad-like in this respect. And they will wander terrestrial environments for a number of years. And depending on the species of newt, it'll be from, say, 2 to up to 8 to 10 years they'll actually wander the land, growing and eating. And then eventually they go through a second metamorphosis where their skin becomes much thinner. And it's much more highly vascularized, so it allows for better respiration. And then they will go back to the water and then stay there as adults for the remainder of their life. So newts have this really odd lifestyle that's different from the traditional forms that you see in the United States. And we talked earlier about pedomorphosis. The axolotl is a classic example of pedomorphosis. So these guys are derivatives of Ambystoma mexicanum. So you can find populations of mexicanum that are not pedomorphic. They look like typical sort of ambystomatid salamanders. But these guys were a population in the south that underwent pedomorphosis. So they became reproductive while retaining this juvenile morphology. And they exist now, and they're very popular in the pet trade. So these guys, even though they have this juvenile morphology, they can actually mate, produce offspring that look just like them. And just so you know, there's other salamanders that do spend their entire lives in the aquatic environment and do maintain these external gills throughout life. Necturus is one of the genera that does this in the United States. And we have them here in Michigan. So they can respire. It's important to note, these guys can respire through their skin, through gills, with lungs, and sometimes they might actually have all three simultaneously, but they might not be actually using them in the same environment simultaneously. Like clearly they're not using their lungs if they're actually in the water. Okay, and then the last order is the Anura. So these are the frogs and toads. So you can identify a frog or a toad anywhere because it's going to be a moist organism. It's got 4 legs and generally speaking does not have a tail with one exception. There is actually what's called the tailed frog, but that's in the northwest region of the US. And you wouldn't see them here. Like the salamanders, they vary in size dramatically from being really small species to being really large species. This is in Indonesia and this is a species from Cuba. We'll talk more about life cycle variations in class. This is the classic that I showed you, but there are some departures from this sort of classic. One departure is they too exhibit, some of them can exhibit direct development. So instead of hatching out of the egg as a tadpole, they actually hatch out as miniature adults. And in class, we'll talk about reproduction, but there are all kinds of variations on that classic slide that I showed you. For instance, there are those individuals that actually have the eggs embedded in their back, and then they hatch out as miniature adults from there. There are gastric brooding frogs. There are frogs that have pouches either in their thighs or on their back where the eggs go in. They undergo gestation and then will hatch out as tadpole forms from the back. And then there's all kinds of fun ones like the poison dart frogs that have eggs that they lay in an aquatic environment in puddles. They hatch out as tadpoles, but then one or the other of the parents will actually carry the tadpoles up to plants and deposit one tadpole into each plant that's holding a little bit of water. And they'll actually come around and feed each of the tadpoles either unfertilized egg, usually it's unfertilized egg, so it's usually the female that's doing the tracking. So we'll talk about variations on the frog and toad lifestyle in class. I'd also like to point out that this idea of a frog versus a toad is a total misnomer. So a lot of people think, oh, frogs are wet and slimy and they're always in the water, and toads are always dry and kind of scaly and they're on the land. Yeah, that's completely untrue. It does work for some places in the United States, but for the rest of the world, that's just not true. So those terms aren't applicable. So there are all kinds of what are known to herpetologists as toad species, but they're not dry, and none of them are scaly. And then sometimes there are frogs that are very capable of being out of the water. They have waxy coatings and all kinds of specializations. So that whole frog and toad thing doesn't really work. Another thing that a lot of people will tell you in the States, and this works for some places, is frogs are leapers and toads are hoppers because they have shorter, stubbier legs. That's not always true either. So we'll talk about that more in class. One reason you might want to care a lot about anurans, and actually amphibians in general, is because they are outstanding indicators of ecosystem health. So because they are so closely tied to the water, whenever there's anything wrong with the water, if there's pollution, if there's invasive microbes in them, if there's anything that's going wrong with your water system, you're going to know it by looking at the amphibians in the region. One of the big issues that's come up in recent years, in the last 10 to 20 years, is this chytrid fungus. So what I'm showing you here is the life cycle of chytrid fungus and how it impacts, in this case, this is a Panamanian frog that's actually, it was thought to have gone extinct, but they've recently found a population that has survived the chytrid invasion. So this fungus actually gets into the water. It's everywhere. We have it all over the United States as well. It's all over the world. And so the zoospores of this fungus will get into the skins of frogs and effectively cause them to suffocate because it prevents them from being able to respire through their skin. And if it gets into tadpoles, it actually gets into their mouth parts and it prevents their tooth rows from forming. And so they effectively starve because they can't feed because they don't have proper mouth parts. So this is one of many emerging diseases that's occurring throughout the world. There's a number of different ranaviruses that are cropping up and diseases. And of course, there's a constant problem with habitat degradation, habitat destruction, and pollution that are impacting amphibians all over the world. And I'll give you some more examples in class when we talk about this, but it's a very big problem. So the diversity and the abundance of amphibians in your environment is usually a good indication to the health. And so you want to monitor amphibians to make sure that they're doing okay. We'll talk about some other interesting adaptations that amphibians have if we have time in class. They're a really fun group, and if you're really interested in reptiles and amphibians, please take my herpetology course in the fall. We're going to have a gas talking about all of them. This is my specialization. Okay, next time, that's all I'm going to tell you about amphibians. Next time we're going to dive into the amniotes, and we'll talk about the major evolutionary innovation of the amniote egg, and we'll talk about all of the amniote taxa and their diversity, and we'll do that the next few weeks. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.